This is Key West. Key West is built on rock. This doesn't look like it'd be much of a problem, except they're not building a lot of new rock in Key West. So eventually that's going to be a problem. And in fact, if you look at all the climate science, there's this hockey stick at the end of the last 3 to 4 decades of the century, because this really it's like a train. It keeps getting, it's exponential. It's going to get worse and worse, and sea level rise will increase as the ocean begins to respond to all this warming, and as the polar ice caps, the ice cap on Greenland and Antarctica begin to melt. But this has been the average for the East Coast and Gulf Coast. What about South Louisiana? We can go down to Grand Isle, which is about 60 miles south of New Orleans as a pelican flies. That's what it's been doing down in South Louisiana. So why is the rest of the country, the East Coast and Gulf, doing this, and it's 4 times the rate in South Louisiana? Because we're sinking at the same time the sea is rising. The average elevation in southeast Louisiana, around New Orleans and outside of New Orleans, is about 2.5 feet. It's about 400 feet down to the first rock here at the mouth of the river, about 150 feet here. It's not a uniform rate of subsidence. It's about 8 feet a century down here at the Bird's Foot Delta, Charlie. Latest measurements. Charlie's once traveled the whole Mississippi River hunting ducks and ended up down here. He's a place he dear to his heart, I know. And under New Orleans, we're losing about 1 inch every 30 months in areas outside of New Orleans. That's 18 inches in 50 years. That's 3 feet in a century. That's not counting sea level rise. If all we had to do right now is worry about sea level rise, the current rates would be not in too bad a shape here in New Orleans and South Louisiana. We added subsidence, that's what we look like. When you add subsidence to the static sea level rise, it's called relative sea level rise. And that's why NOAA says southeast Louisiana is sinking at the fastest rate of any large coastal landscape on the planet. They're expecting to see, the National Climate Assessment said that the country can expect 3 to 3.5 feet of sea level rise from warming by the end of the century at the current rates of emission and temperature. South Louisiana, they say, will see 5.5 to 6 feet of relative sea level rise. This is an area that averages 2.5 feet of elevation. You can see these are the states. This is from the EPA and NOAA and NASA. This is sea level rise at different places. You can see Grand Isle and Louisiana leads the pack. This is how much land, we say land in South Louisiana, a lot of that is wetlands, but it's important. That's what we'll lose. Research earlier this year shows that if we can't keep temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees centigrade, then probably around 2060 there'll be dramatic melting in Antarctica, which is huge mountains of frozen water, and that'll add another meter of sea level rise, another 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And that's what it would look like. These are all towns and communities that would be, people would have to move. So that's what we'll look like between 2060 and 2090. And what does that look like? That looks like that second picture I showed you, right? When you took out all the wetlands, because they'll be gone. And this water will reach pretty close to Baton Rouge. The problem with this is only property behind hurricane storm surge protection levees. Those levees are made out of mud because they only have to repel water for a few hours or a few days. If they're in the water 24/7, 365, they'll collapse. The new levees around New Orleans, which you helped pay for, which are a lot of concrete, those cost $14.5 billion. What would it cost to build those types of levees up and down here? Why should you care? Well, this is still the most productive coastal estuary outside of Alaska. 70% of the migratory waterfowl in North America winter or stop over in Louisiana. Louisiana hunters every year kill more ducks than all the duck hunters in the Atlantic and Central Flyways combined. And it's not just because we're better shooters, and We are. Or that we're better cooks, and we are. It's because they're there. I mean, I can get a limit in Louisiana. Well, maybe some. We also have the top 200 seafood landings in the contiguous U.S. 90% of all Gulf marine species are estuarine dependent. That means they were either born, raised, and die in an estuary, or they're offshore species, reef species, or pelagic species, and they depend on the product of this estuary for an important part of their life cycle. All the fish in the Gulf of Mexico, from Florida to Texas, depend on estuaries, and about 90% of that estuary habitat is right here in South Louisiana, and that's what's being lost. You know, people say, when you think of fishing in southern U.S., people say Florida. We laugh at Florida fishing in Louisiana. For example, the speckled trout, spotted sea trout limit, daily limit in Florida is 5. In Louisiana, it's 25. Louisiana sports fishermen take home about 10 million speckled trout every year. They've been doing that for decades. And it's not just because we're better fishermen, which we are. It's because they're there. I can catch a limit. So can China. His old pal, a guide. They're there, and that's the habitat we're losing, and eventually we'll have fishing like Florida, which isn't very good. But everyone else will suffer as well. 50% of the nation's wild shrimp crop come from these marshes in South Louisiana. 35% of its blue claw crabs. If you ate crab cakes in the Chesapeake for about 30 or 40 years, you were eating Louisiana crabs. 40% of the oysters come from there, and it's not just things we eat. For example, 110 species of neotropical migrants use South Louisiana. 50 species nest there. And neotropical gumbo is really good. What if you don't care, and you guys do, about the birds and the bees and the furry creatures? What if you only care about your wallet? This is what people don't realize. When they think of South Louisiana, all you think about is party town. You think of people dressing up in costumes and walking down the street, like someone we know here, and having a good time. Eat, drink, be merry, laissez les bâtons rouler. But we're actually an economic linchpin. No one talks about that. No one comes to New Orleans or South Louisiana to see the port of the pipelines of the refineries. You come there to eat, to drink, listen to music, maybe do things you get arrested for doing at home. But here's some news for a lot of people. We're the second leading domestic producer of oil and gas. 90% of the nation's energy production comes through our coast, not just from those thousands of oil rigs, something called LOOP, the Louisiana Offshore Oil Port. It's a big floating dock off our coast, and giant tankers from around the world pull up to it, hook up, and unload, because it's going to 50% of the nation's refining capacity. And that stuff goes, a lot of it, goes to your cities. This huge complex, we're also the top tonnage port in the nation, one of the largest in the world. 60% of the grain exports come through New Orleans. 40% of the coal exports. There are mountains of coal south of the city. Coal comes down in barges, grain comes down in barges, big crane elevators stacked up in Baton Rouge, New Orleans. 31 states are directly impacted by this. When the port is closed, it costs the nation about $300 million a day. It used to close only for hurricanes because we had 80 to 100 miles of wetlands between us and the Gulf of Mexico. And the wetlands are linear levees. They absorb storm surge. The marshes do, and swamps are even better because they attenuate wind. So if there was a storm, even not even a Category 1, if it was a 2 or 3, they would close the port and the energy coast. Now they have to close it anytime the Weather Service says we're 96 hours away from tropical storm force winds, 35 miles an hour. Everything has to shut down. It takes that long. Everything comes to a halt, and the economy grinds to a halt. This is from the U.S. Department of Transportation. These are the major trucking routes from the major ports. New York, New Jersey, very important. We hate to admit this, Texas is important. Houston, West Coast, Pacific Rim, Long Beach, really important. What about the ports of South Louisiana? These are the major trucking routes in the ports of South Louisiana. And why is that? Well, if you make anything here, you want to sell it to the world, the most economic way to move it in volume is by ship. If you want to get to the world's oceans, you got to come down this river or get to this port and put it on ships. And conversely, if you make anything in the rest of the world, you want to sell it to this really wealthy market, ships. Got to come through New Orleans. So all that's at risk now. All that oil and gas infrastructure, the pipelines that once were buried are now being exposed to storm surges, the refineries, billions of dollars in infrastructure, not to mention about 2 million people. So what are we doing about it? Nothing much, really, until Katrina. And when there were about 5 feet of water in the city, the state said, you know, maybe those wetlands are important. When the port closed down and price of gas jumped 46 cents a gallon over a weekend nationwide, they said, maybe this is important. So they had this plan. They passed something called the Coastal Master Plan in 2007. They created an agency that focused all its attention on this, and they came up with help from scientists from around the world, that plan, the Coastal Master Plan. It's a blueprint, 50 years, $50 billion in 2010 dollars. When they add inflation, it's about $92 billion by the time it's finished. The idea is to put the river back to work in these sinking basins. Half that money actually goes to structural protection from storm surge, levees, flood walls, and some of it goes to helping people adapt in place by raising their homes, flood-proofing their homes. The other half is going to try, the computers say that this plan works if it's implemented on time. We could have enough wetlands to have a sustainable fishery and attenuate storm surge. How will we do that? 2 ways. This has been going on since 2000. There are all kinds of projects, shoreline stabilization, rebuilding some of these barrier islands and beachfronts. The 2 main ways of rebuilding all these wetlands, we can't rebuild them all. We can maintain some of what we have left and rebuild a tiny amount of what we've lost. The first way is basically dredge programs. They'll mine sediment from the rivers, pump it into these sinking basins. We've done that in 2 or 3 places, 700 acres, 2 feet above sea level in about 60 days. About $40 million. They're going to devote $12 billion to that process all along the coast in key areas. The problem with that process is what happens once you stop. So 20 or 30 years later, it's like a conservation easement. You got to go back there and do it again. The second way are sediment diversions, controlled river sediment diversions. It's like putting floodgates in the levee, and when the river's high, you open those floodgates and it carries the freshwater and sediment back out there to rebuild these wetlands. We know that works. Whoops, I'm going to show you how that works if I can get back here. Hold on 1 second. I forgot I had this. This is, ironically, Mississippi is the fastest sinking eroding delta. About 60 miles to the west is the mouth of the Atchafalaya. There are no levees there. This is the Atchafalaya and Wax Lake deltas, 1984. That's what it looks like today. So, yes, we can rebuild and we can stay ahead of the current rate of sea level rise if we do these diversions. And that's what we're going to try to do here. These are the two or three places we've done the dredge and fill operations. Problem is, we're the second leading producer of oil and gas. We're about the 4th poorest state in the nation. Don't ask me how it got that way. We need about, if these projects are not built on schedule and on time, obviously we won't be able to do as much work. We'll have a smaller coast. So far, the country has given us $10 million. That's really to the Corps of Engineers to beneficial dredge the river, the shipping channel. They spend $100 million a year dredging that shipping channel. Until now, they've just put that stuff back up in the river and let it carry it offshore. Now they're going to be able to take it and put it over the levees to help rebuild these wetlands. We're going to get $50 million a year for 15 years from BP for the Deepwater Horizon disaster. This is a figure was before oil crash. Gulf Mesa is Louisiana and the Gulf states, offshore states that are getting a little bit larger percentage of the offshore oil and gas royalties that used to go straight to the federal government. And the state's been kicking in as much money as it has. Unfortunately, that means we're going to have about $1 billion a year shortfall beginning in about 10 or 15 years. And what does that mean? We'll have a smaller coast, weaker storm defenses, crashing seafood production, rising insurance rates, economic crisis. We're all going to move to Chicago, and you don't want that to happen. You've already got one guy here from Louisiana. So this is a recent map showing what happens in a 100-year storm, which isn't even a Category 3 storm. This is the flood depths. Purple is 15 feet or greater. Even the green is 4 to 6 feet. So clearly there's a migration already starting, basically market motivated, because people are tired of getting flooded, tired of getting cut off. There are lots of roads down here that flood now just on 2 or 3 days of a stiff south wind. And so this is happening. And according to all the latest forecasts and the measurements of sea level rise and climate change, if we're not actively involved in reducing emissions and getting this program going in the next 10 or 15 years, it will be too late. So I'll leave you with this. So people think the problem's too big for them, they can't do anything about it. We need people in other states especially, when these projects come up in Congress, to tell their congressional delegation, this is more, it's not just about these crazy Cajuns who just want to get drunk and party, which we do, but it's about you as well. In 2007, after Katrina, the House authorized 15 projects for the Coastal Master Plan. There was an election, there was a different party in control, and since then not a single one has been appropriated. And that's a problem for us. So, if you want South Louisiana to be here, if you want the economic benefits, not to mention the fish and wildlife benefits, and if you don't want a bunch of Cajuns moving into your neighborhood, we need to get this solved. Any questions? Questions? I did a great job. Thank you for listening. What?
Where is the money on this?
You know, Louisiana, if you were a company and you had a big expense come up, you look for what resources you had to spend. Right? Louisiana has one or two valuable resources. One is called oil, the other is called gas. And the oil and gas industry, which is responsible for a large part of the damage, not all of it, they don't want to step up.
They don't care about the fish here.
Well, they don't care about the fish, but they have a hell of a lot of investments here that are exposed, that are getting damaged, that can't be moved. You can't move these pipelines. You can't get a permit for a refinery. Who wants a refinery? Panhandle of Florida? You're not going to move those pipelines there. No one's going to move the rigs. Houston doesn't want them. So, my opinion covering this is they're waiting for another disaster, and they'll get the federal government to come in and fix this. But it may be beyond that. It's really, in a way they're right. If we don't address emissions, if we get 6.5 feet of sea level rise, lots of, in fact, this plan is adaptive, okay? It's adaptive management. Every 5 years, Louisiana is the smartest thing they ever did politically, and that's a low bar, I know, but this is actually a good thing. These experts put this plan together, these scientists and engineers and architects. They went out to public meetings, got public comment, they finalized it, they brought it to the state legislature. And the law says the legislature can only vote it up or down, they cannot amend it. Okay? And they've endorsed it unanimously twice, every 5 years, because there's such a dynamic landscape. It's sinking, the sea's rising. They're creating science and doing science and research and engineering on the fly, so they have to redo this every 5 years and go back to the legislature. 5 years ago, the worst case scenario for sea level rise, and the 27 plan that comes out in 2 weeks, that's the best case scenario. That's how much the science has changed, and that's how much more steep this challenge has gotten. There's a lot at stake here. Most of the country doesn't know about it, but if these, if the oil stops and the gas stops, you know, farmers can't ship their grain, people will know about it. All these states in the Mississippi Valley depend, to a large extent, on New Orleans to get their products out.
So, is there a way to align the gas and oil interests and the conservation interests in a way to move this forward? I know it seems on its face to be probably not possible, but trying to find a pathway through this, is there a way to do that?
The simplest way would be, and this has been suggested and has been rejected, and that would be to say, hey, oil and gas companies, we'll give you immunity from any future lawsuits if you support an increase in the excise taxes you pay on every gallon, every cubic, yard that you pump out of here. And then we would have a permanent source of funding for this plan, and we could go about the business of rebuilding some of these wetlands and protecting your infrastructure. So far they said, no, we already pay enough. Like, well, everyone pays a lot now, but plus they also take credit for all the federal excise taxes they pay, the royalties. That goes to the country. That's not, a small portion is directed at this, and that's because the nation decided to direct it there. I can't think of another, unless the nation wants to come in, and so far it's not a good time for national projects. It's just the country doesn't, the Congress doesn't really believe in that stuff right now. So, and this is a deadline. Every year they delay in getting this stuff done means less they can build, less we can preserve, more danger to the residents and the industry. So, our congressional delegation talks about this, and yet, as a group, except for the one Democrat, they are deniers on climate change. They oppose emissions controls. They want to blame all this on the levees on the river. It's the nation's fault for building levees on the river. We wanted them to build the levees, right, so we wouldn't get flooded. So, this nation usually does things by disaster, and I'm afraid it may take another disaster with lots of oil everywhere for them to come in and say, hey, we got to stop this. Charlie?
Two-part question. If there is another Katrina disaster, what do you think the odds are the rest of the country will say, just move New Orleans, be done with it, we're not doing it again? That's the first part. Okay. And the second question is, why does this not get traction? Why do we care so much about the Everglades and Grand Canyon, which are just nothing compared to this? Why that dynamic?
Well, the first question is, I already said that. After Katrina, you're stupid to live there. Actually, Dennis Hastert came down to New Orleans after Katrina, and he was touring one of the neighborhoods that flooded. He actually said this in the press thing, I don't know why anyone would even want to live here. He made a lot of friends. So I was at a panel, and after Superstorm Sandy hit New York, and someone asked me, what was your thoughts when you saw that happening? I said, why do they live there? Let's move New York. They've had 2 hurricanes in 3 years. San Francisco. What do people say when there's a disaster in Montana or Oregon? They say it's not in my state. So I don't think it's really that unusual for people to say you should move. And there's this false impression that we're constantly flooded in New Orleans, and that's just not the case. The other question is, those are national parks. They can get traction because the federal government has to take care of them. The Everglades, Grand Canyon. This has never been this is a working coast. People live here, they make money off of it. They drill for oil and gas, they have commercial fisheries and recreational fisheries. No one wants to make this a park. Okay, so I think it doesn't get traction. I've talked about it on the radio shows across the country, including in Chicago. People in the environmental community are aware of this, but they weren't really involved until after Katrina. They were more concerned about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which no one will ever see. And they weren't even involved in South Louisiana until after Katrina. Now, several of them are doing good work down there. So, I think it's a symptom of the national personality right now that if it's not happening in my state, in my city, in my parish or county, it's too bad. And try to get, if it says national audit, try to get that through Congress today. And it's really crazy because prevention saves you lots of money. Katrina cost the nation about $210 billion. FEMA went broke. They're still paying off that, I think. And, you know, if you do just a little prevention in some of this stuff, then you save a lot of money and you prevent tragedy and deaths. I mean, we had 1,400 people killed in Katrina. And by the way, Katrina was caught, the city flooded not because of the storm, but because of levees that were improperly built by the Corps of Engineers. So, but we need help. All the science and computers show this will work. They do an amazing engineering and 3D modeling. And our first diversion, thanks to BP, I guess if we had a few more rigs blow up in the Gulf, we would have enough money. But we can get that built. And the state's this crazy dichotomy where this plan is the most developed and so far funded climate adaptation plan in the nation for sure, maybe in the world. And half of our, well, 9/10 of our congressional delegation claims that climate change, you know, doesn't exist, or it's a hoax, or it's not as bad, it's not caused by what the science says it is. You know, we're kind of like, the analogy I use is like people look at us and say, well, you're like maybe someone with lung cancer is trying to crowdsource money for chemo, but doesn't want to quit smoking. And that's one of our problems right there. Any other questions? Thank you for listening, and please remember this.